The name Giambattista Vico doesn't usually come up in university courses about philosophy or culture, so don't be surprised if you've never heard of him before. For the small group of people who have heard of him, and even for the smaller group who have managed to read any of his works, the opinion is unanimous. Vico was a very original guy. I wouldn't say that there is a new Vico for every occasion, or every reader, but if you think that Vico is about discovery, the discovery is ongoing. You don't just find new territory and domesticate it. The territory is radically and continually wild, and you have to go back to it each time with the mindset of an explorer in a strange land. You'll need tools to make things and defend yourself, shelter to stay warm and dry as possible, and a map and compass to know where you are going. Reading and writing were not separate to Vico. He specifically tells us that writing the new science was only half of his project. The reader reading it was the other half. This didn't mean that he was waiting for the perfect reader to come along. He meant for you to do your best, and even if you don't grasp an idea, you should think of the idea being grasped by a reader, not an idea that is encrypted by the writer playing hard to get. You read it, you think it, and even if you don't get it right the first or even the millionth time, you become the new science. There are several things you need to know about trying to read Vico. First is, he repeats himself, seemingly endlessly. You think he has early onset Alzheimer's. You wouldn't be the first to notice this. Here's how to think of it. When you look at an ordinary hand-holdable object, you turn it over and check out all the sides. Pretty soon you get an idea of the whole thing. But if you have a large precious jewel in your hand, you turn it over once, twice, and many more times. Each turn shows you the same face in a different light. In Vico's text, there's an idea, then there's an idea plus something else, then there's an idea plus more something else's. Each addition of information changes what you think the idea is really about. It's not enough to see it in just one context. Adding layers to an idea is like getting a perspective from a high point on your hike. Traditionally, each paragraph in Vico's New Science is numbered. References to different translations don't depend on page numbers, which would change with every new edition. The book is divided into sections that make it sound first like a logical treatise. Elements, principles, method. But then Vico strikes a bell that will keep on ringing through the rest of the book. This is the bell of the poetic. This is not poetry as we normally think about it. This is Vico's name for the way that humans thought from the first moment they became truly human. But what does Vico mean by poetic? He doesn't mean that the first humans were subjective or fanciful. He means that the first humans valued logic, truth, observation, and corroboration of evidence just as much as we do. They were extremely practical-minded. But the kind of logic they used was different from ours. Ours is a conceptual and hierarchical kind of knowledge. We like to group things into phyla, classes, types, and so on. The first logic was not hierarchical. We might say it was sequential, a kind of if-then way of thinking. But mythic time was not the same as our time. Ours goes along a line, and when that line seems to be violated, as with lapses of memory or déjà vu, we know something's wrong. Metaphoric time ran in two directions at once. Forward to a future that needed to be predicted with careful procedures, called divination. The other direction was a motion to connect it back to a point in the past, not just to remember it or describe it sentimentally, but to relive it. Imagine an arrow going left to right, and another arrow arching from right to left. The point in the future is an unknown, an X. The point in the past is also an unknown, but it's unknown because it can't ever be exhausted by words or pictured as an ordinary event. You know the jewel idea. This point is like the jewel. Its meaningfulness can't be encapsulated by meanings. In fact, it prevents meanings from setting up camp using ordinary signification. Freud also discovered this jewel point, where every attempt to describe it produced a word and a word that was also an opposite. Sometimes the word was the same word, called a contronym. We still use many of them, such as the Latin word sacer, which means something both respected and reviled, or altus, which means both high and low, and hostes, which means both hospitality and hostility. Our modern thought has simplified these to get rid of the contrary meanings, but ancient thought, poetic thought, treated such terms as jewels. Okay, you have the idea that early humans used a poetry that was operating like a science, the idea of time that moves in two directions at once, and the idea that the negation we use to distinguish things from their opposites is missing. Now let me throw in another potentially confusing term, myth. We think of myths as outlandish stories where characters have supernatural powers. This is not far off the mark if we include the idea that a myth was a song for the purpose of putting things into place and keeping them in place. For the metaphoric brain of the first humans, everything was mythic in the sense that there was a narrative context of every living thing and every natural object. The story was about these things and where they came from. Like any good story, it left a lot to the imagination. The stories were sung in ceremonies the first humans used to practice divination, to celebrate marriages, to bury the dead. They were sung to prevent the dead from haunting the living, but also to get their blessing in the form of goods and services. If you like the idea of the magic spell, that's also appropriate, but it applies more to the private use of songs where you mutter something under your breath to get someone to fall in love with you, or if they're creeps, to get them to drop dead. Cities could be sung into order, but also cursed into destruction, as was the biblical story of the defeat of Jericho. Singing and walls go together. The pomerium was a space required between a double wall so that priests could regularly restore the wall's protective capabilities. Another thing you need to know before your Vico camping trip is that space as well as time was important for the metaphoric mind of the first humans. The first humans didn't just suddenly get born from ape ancestors. They were human in form, and they used communications of all kinds. But these were animal kind of communications, and they could be very sophisticated. The point to remember is that these communication systems were not yet metaphoric. They did not have the double structure of time or the ability to combine opposites. They had no magic value. There were no stories because there was no way to represent thoughts or motives. Vico is not saying that there were no communication systems before metaphor. He's saying that the first truly human language was metaphoric, and that humans became humans because they communicated poetically and metaphorically. This probably made them actually inferior to animals in the way that once metaphor was realized, signification took a different turn. There was no longer a confident one-to-one relation between things and names. Things were made strange, not clearer, through the first human's poetic mentality. This was what made divination absolutely necessary. The objects and features of nature were no longer obvious or evident. Nature was always hiding behind something, and its secrets, which didn't exist before metaphor came onto the scene, had to be tricked out through methods of divination. Here we have to ask another spatial question. Where did all of this happen? Vico says that prehumans were wandering through the primeval forests, which offered no view of the sky. They were ready for metaphor, so to speak, because they were already using sign systems that were sophisticated and extensive. But they did not have the concept of hiding. They didn't see that there were any secrets to nature, only raw materials for them to consume by turning things into signifiers. This primal forest was literally a place where you could run but you couldn't hide. The capability of hiding was missing, and thus language was missing its essential ingredient. Here we have to make a short digression to deal with the mechanics of metaphor. Metaphor is not just a poetic way of putting something, or an analogy to compare something familiar to something strange. It's a genuinely transformative mental act. My way of modeling this is to abstract the idea of the sensorium, the sequence of our perceptual experiences, as a series of encounters that follow each other in a temporal line. If the sequence is suddenly interrupted by something quantitatively huge, there's no time to think about what's happening. Sensation overwhelms and surprises us. Vico was probably the first person to think about how this could be a cause for metaphoric thinking in general, even for pre-human minds with no real metaphoric sensibility. The only thing you can really say about a sequence of sudden, extremely loud, and incredibly close encounters is that they have a duration, a beginning and an end. These frame markers are the only data we have, no clues as to where they come from or what they mean, just the frame. The technical term for this reference to the frame is metallepsis, so I use the phrase metallepsis of the signifying chain to say how, within our temporal sensorium, something can happen that, like a Morse code, can tap out a signification that is meaningful, but without any specific meanings. What does this mean? At this point, we can only say that there is a something, an X. We don't know what X is, but it exists as what the loud sequence has tried to signify. To turn this into a metaphor, we have to consider how, in language, each new word is chosen from a list of possible substitutions. Many of them are conventional and expected. But here we're dealing with something that, when it came its turn in the syntime to fill in the blank, provided an unexpected surprise that didn't make sense with what had come before. This interruption was quantitative, not qualitative. It wasn't about meaning in any conventional sense, but its place in the syntagmatic chain meant that it was still meaningful. It canceled out meanings, but not meaningfulness. This is how metaphor points to something and is unable to say just what it's talking about. This makes metaphor portable. Something seems to have been hidden from us, and as a result, we can extend the metaphor to almost anything with the same structure. Rather than determinative meanings, we look at patterns, rhythms, motifs. Metaphor shifts the gears of communications from designation of meaning to multiple potentialities of meaning. Vico invented his own metaphor to describe what happened to the pre-humans wandering in the forest primeval. This was the story about the thunder. In one group, then another, loud thunder terrified the first pre-humans. At some point, the thunder was so loud that they conceived that the thunder was actually a word, a very long and complex word, one that concealed within it a kind of cipher, holding a secret. If only they could decode this word, it would tell them all about the secret. And because words came only from speakers, the sky must be a subject like themselves, only larger and more powerful. The famous 20th century Irish author James Joyce seized upon Vico's idea of the thunder and produced, in his novel Finnegan's Wake, multiple versions of a 99-letter word that included, some scholars have claimed, all of the roots of Indo-European languages. Whether or not this is true, it captures the idea that the thunder, even now, sounds like a word we are not meant to understand. And it is this withholding of meaning that converts a sign system into a true language. Thunder intensified the anxiety that the first humans had already felt towards natural and human threats. So to clarify what Jove might have meant to say to them led to attempts to get a better view of the sky and its signs. These were called eyes because they were both openings and observatories. Each group had a single eye used for divination and rituals of initiation, marriage, and burial. Because the first cultures were called Cyclopean on account of their allegiance of each family to its own altar, this gave rise to the mistaken depiction of the Cyclops as monsters with single eyes, the kind that Odysseus encountered during his travels. Instead, the first eyes connected earth to heaven with acts of ritual divination, looking for meanings to attach to Jove's generic meaningfulness. Because Jove was imagined as a giant body, the sky was thought to be the skull of Jove. Below it, or within it, was the visible world. Above it was a divine ideal represented by the peaks of mountains or the sacred precincts on citadels above cities, such as the Acropolis at Athens. Most importantly, Jove's skull connected directly, through the hearth fire, to the collectivized skull of dead ancestors who ruled from below the ground. Between these antipodal skulls, the flame of the hearth, ruled over by the goddess Hestia, cooked sacrificial offerings and also fed the dead. The first altars were used to measure the precise movements of sun, moon, and stars. But because divination was central to the collection and preservation of knowledge based on these observations, the eyes were also libraries, hospitals, and political centers. And because the dead were honored at the hearth, the underworld supplied divination results as well, in the form of latent or secret signifiers, different from the signs of the sky. The sky spoke in images and similarities. The underworld spoke in riddles. The first form was presentational. The second was self-referential and joke-like. Once established, an altar could not be moved. The Cyclopes imagined that their altars were fixed to the literal soil and unique location beneath a specific point of the sky. Moving would have brought bad luck from the spirits who resided in the hearth, and anyone defecting to another family's hearth would cause disaster. These beliefs were summarized by the story of Prometheus, who was chained to a rock while an eagle, a personification of Jove, plucked out his liver, the favorite organ for divination. This was Vico's big discovery. What was it exactly? We have described its effects, but not its causes. Vico is, in this case, the founder of modern psychology, or rather psychoanalysis, although the difference is a bit too complicated to deal with at the moment. Vico argued that pre-humans became real humans because they took their own nature, which was fierce and crude, and projected it as the quality of an object, in this case the sky. Projection happens every day. We unconsciously think of ourselves as greedy and conniving, but instead of realizing our own nature, we think of others as greedy and conniving, and prepare to defend ourselves. Projection and transference are Psychology 101. It's human nature to not be able to see ourselves except when we are reflected in other people. Vico realized this on the pop psychology level, but the difference is that he figured out how it happened when pre-humans had not yet acquired the ability to metaphorize. Against the background of being able to signify, but not metaphorize, he realized the enormous impact of this turn. With metaphor, you would know less about the world, have less mastery of it through your signifying systems, but you would gain a virtual space and virtual time that had an infinite wealth of potential meaning. Let's say that the first humans went from meanings, one-to-one names for things and processes, to meaningfulness, an ability to make use of large chunks of virtual unknowledge. Things that we know, that we don't know, but more important, things that we don't know that we don't know. This goes by a special name, kenosis, a way of knowing without knowing. This means that when we try to express ourselves, we always fall short of the right words. The other side of this coin is that whenever we open our mouths, we say more than we think we're saying, things that we are deaf to, but other people hear immediately. If that's not hard enough to wrap your head around, add the idea that's critical to metaphorical thinking, the fact that it is self-developing. Without humans having to know anything about the virtual divine developed by itself. It had a peculiar autonomy that was self-generative. This meant that although humans would be forbidden to shape or change the virtual divine worlds, those worlds would change themselves. They would evolve new forms, new characters, new kinds of actions, thinking, and existing. Myth began with characters with supernatural powers. It then evolved gods with shortcomings. Gradually, hero-like figures appeared, then human-divine composite heroes able to bridge between human and divine worlds. The heroes of mythology were allowed to visit Hades and return alive. The hero gained a kind of immortality. Finally, fully modern humans would require a world built around single ideas and hierarchical relationships. For logic, principles as well as deities have to be single. We see how Vico's 3 ages are about the process of condensation from the multiple to the one. The self-evolving nature of this virtual divine ended, so Vico claimed, with a fully human model, a third age following the ages of gods and heroes. In this age, humans had no magical powers, only their own ingenuity. A little of the divine remained, however, in the way that tricks, jokes, art, and other clever things seem to be beyond explanation. There is in every culture the tradition that a great artist, like Faust, had been taught by the devil or given a violin or flute made by the devil, because no one can explain how they learned to be so skilled. There were, in this third age, still experiences that were uncanny. Things could still be meaningful and amazing that could not be explained or even described. In fact, meaningfulness always seems to elude us. We can't find the words for it, but it's nonetheless personally and emotionally significant. In the third age, the age of humans, godly powers are abbreviated, domesticated, or missing entirely. Heroics exist, but without the usual assistance of the gods, only superpowers fictionally attached. Doesn't metaphor disappear entirely in this third age? Isn't the metaphor a little better than the standard analogy that lets us compare things in a very rational way? The answer is no, and the reasons for this is that while gods and demons have disappeared, latency and portability have not. These are the ghost lines of metaphor that endure, even when the mediums of their existence have been secularized and normalized. There are several categories of latency and portability. In the uncanny, we have experiences of clairvoyance and déjà vu, time travel. In the genre of literature known as the fantastic, we have themes of the double and contamination of reality by dreams and works of fiction. But even in serious subjects, such as quantum physics, we have the phenomenon of spooky entanglement. It doesn't take much to crack the thin shell of reality. Many people take stories of wild conspiracies as real, and all of us are still fascinated by coincidences. Metaphor hides something. The metaphor of Jove, as thunder, hid what Jove meant to say in the thunder by making the thunder's words so long and complex that it seemed to be a kind of cipher. The first humans didn't have enigma machines, but they did have rituals designed to do the same thing. To see the sky and the signs of the sky, they made clearings in the forest. These were the sites of the first altars. Marriage ceremonies and funerals were held there, because the clearings functioned as the first temples. Temple, in fact, comes from the root tem, meaning to divide. The sacrificial victim provided signs, once dissected, pertaining to the uncertain future. But the tem of sacrifice was also the sky as a dividing line between the visible and the invisible, between Jove's outward signs of thunder and skyward events, and his concealed intentions to help or harm. From the point of metaphor's invention of the tem, the sky was regarded as the source of all human laws. The Roman Senate, like many other cultures, was required to meet beneath an open blue sky. The tem can be the sky or something smaller. It is the face of things, behind which intentions and natures can be hidden. It became the basis for architecture's strategy of concealing interiors behind facades, courtyard voids within solid buildings, turns and twists within spaces following the logic of the Daedalus labyrinth. In the standard 19th century facade of many American courthouses, we see the concealment in three forms: the sanctified interior of the main courtroom, protected by oaths and laws, the vault containing deeds, maps, and charters that legitimize legal placement of citizens of the county, and a tower surmounting the dome in reference to the antipodal legitimacy of the sky. We can see how this facade distributes its interest using the same schema as Vico's gods, heroes, and humans. Knowing about metaphor's ability to make a concealment function that is portable can be explained in a story Vico doesn't tell, but it's so efficient to make the point that I will tell it anyway. Two painters in ancient Athens, rivals, decided to put the question of who was better to a test. Each would paint a mural along the same stretch of wall. Independent judges would critique each work and decide. The first painter, Zeuxis, was an expert in making lifelike representations. For his entry, he painted a bowl of fruit sitting on a table beyond a trompe-l'oeil window. It was so realistic that when the judges had the artist unveil his work, a bird flying overhead saw the fruit and went for it, cracking his head when he hit the wall. The judges were very impressed because the bird was completely objective and had lost his life on betting the fruit was real. Hard to do better than that. When they moved on to the second painter, Parrhasius, they found his work was still curtained. Parrhasius made no move, and the judges thought he was just depressed about his chances, after such a brilliant demonstration by Zeuxis. Finally, they asked him to pull back the curtain and show his work. He hesitated. But the curtain is my work. The judges had to give the prize to Parrhasius. Why? Because although Zeuxis had fooled a bird, Parrhasius had fooled the eyes of the human experts intent on judging him. In Zeuxis's case, they all knew it was a painting. Parrhasius had made them think the curtain was real. All Thames are like Parrhasius's curtain. This is a big deal for architecture, whose business it is to design and construct Thames. A Thames is not a curtain or wall per se. Rather, it is the split between the viewer and viewed that is active in all kinds of representations and built conditions. It's a distinction, not a thing being distinguished. Now, can you see how the latency function of metaphor, which sets up a way of knowing without knowing, intersects with architecture's own primal function of splitting spaces into actual and virtual? We need to get back to Vico, who gives away all his secrets in the first 30 pages or so of his 1744 classic, The New Science. Vico was not a rich academic. He had to get help covering the expenses of his publications. For this third edition, he had asked a famous Venetian architect, Carlo Lodoli, for a subsidy. Lodoli at first agreed, but withdrew his offer at the last minute. Vico was furious and planned to publish the book anyway at his own expense, but with a letter denouncing Lodoli. His friends advised him not to do this, however. Lodoli was an influential politician and could have easily hurt Vico's reputation. But the printer had already set up the pages for the new book, and removing the letter left a blank section that had to be filled in some way. Vico says that he decides to design, at the last minute, a visual picture of the whole idea of the new science, accompanied by a commentary on each item in the emblem and its role in culture's self-evolving history. But it may be that Vico invented the whole last-minute thing so that he could demonstrate how metaphor could work as a kind of modern magic in an age far removed from the gods of myth. The image was a tour de force. It showed a divine eye, inscribed in a triangle and a circle, radiating down to metaphysics, represented as a goddess figure standing on a celestial globe perched on the edge of the altar of the first human ceremonial clearing. Clearly, Vico's image was intended as an act of genius, akin to the clap of thunder that had frightened the first humans into their own metaphorical consciousness. Vico presents this as a kind of fraud. The first humans think that there is a god behind the thunder, which Vico says, as a good Catholic, couldn't be true. But the rest of the new science argues that this fake attribution had real and true effects, namely that it brought about a culture of piety and poetry, a self-evolving consciousness. Our modern examples of this kind of genius focus on the theme of violation. Goethe's Faust breaks the rules when he makes a deal with the devil, but this is a modern translation of Vico's first event of thunder. The first humans cannot help but see the sky as a divine presence. Faust has a choice, but the role of ingenuity, what Vico called Ingenium, worked in the same way as the thunder. Metaphor's ability to create latency is the same as architecture's ability to create voids, where literal meanings are forbidden to enter. The void as such works like a womb, where the idea of architecture can be miniaturized in full, just like the models that were made for the client in anticipation of the actual building. Comparing the model to the helmet of Hermes leads to some interesting connections. Both use the logic of the lipogram, the latent or repressed signifier, to make a union possible. In Filarete's theory, this is the impregnation of the mother architect by the father client. The building that itself has a void can exist in its own void, as a void, a matrix or mother whose secret is that she knows who the father is, but the father will and can never know. The identity of architecture lies with whoever designs and controls the voids. The Tim idea holds even more treasures. If metaphor were the same thing as analogy, latency would not exist. An unfamiliar thing or situation would simply be compared to something more familiar. But metaphor is different. Its spoken and visible terms exist in relation to something else, something invisible. The familiar and the unfamiliar have a space in between that emerges out of the fact that metaphor, taken from something known, has the power to transform its source retroactively. A wind metaphorized as a sigh turns all winds into a kind of breathing. And if that's so, there must be somewhere a being that can blow fiercely or gently or hold its breath. Metaphor doesn't just describe a world, it remakes a world. In the rhyming comparison of womb and tomb, womb transforms the idea of tomb and vice versa. There is no saying that the womb is like a tomb or the tomb is like a womb, but that one cannot be understood without the other. They are two opposite ideas tied together, what Freud called a contronym, a primal term. You might be tempted to think that latency was an abstract and complicated idea, but nothing could be further from the truth. This experiment shows that latency has a perceptual basis in our experience of the afterimage created when a color vanishes to leave behind its complementary shadow, something that was in our eye all the time, but not realized until a void, an absence, was created. Take a steady look at the cross in the center, and you will see a green dot move around the circle. But if you look directly at the hole made by removing each pink dot in succession, you won't see it. Latency is not something abstract. It's a concrete process that allows us to experience meaningfulness without having specific meanings at hand. This is what happens when we say that words have failed us. The words have failed, but latency has not. We can take apart the words and ideas of womb and tomb to show how their retroactive and reciprocal self-definition creates a latency that works thanks to absence. It doesn't hurt that both of these terms directly refer to absence, which is why they are so useful to architecture and our ideas of space and time. If we draw on some common associations of womb and tomb, we can create a ladder of references that move side to side rather than vertically down from each term. We can apply this to the womb-tomb examples to show how contronymic sets of meanings work, like making a clearing in the forest did for the first humans. Latency is where it's at, so to speak. But of course latency is about where it's not. Negation is the key. Whereas the original terms were structured by the negation of one by the other, the womb by the tomb, negation is absent in the structure of latency. Just as the dream disallows negation and lets us see dead people as if they were living, and the past as a future, latency provides new paradigms that step back from opposition and put us on a different level. It's time to sober up, just long enough to realize that, all along, we have been describing the famous process of condensation. In Freud's thinking, this is the way the dream crunches down objects, people, and ideas into composites. We start out with a composite, however. It's the first thing we get, but it's got antipodal elements packed inside. Like getting genies out of the bottle, the little rascals disperse and locate themselves into things we recognize. Common objects, images, architectures. But it has come to us first like the thunder, an enigma without any apparent structure. We say we want to unpack this mess, but what we end up pulling apart is not just a set of opposed ideas, but a void in between, a void that is the latency that allowed for the compression in the first place. When the first humans cowered in fright at the sound of thunder, the difference between them and other animals who did the same thing was that they sensed the action of compression. They imagined a black hole in the universe that had swallowed up all that was outside it, and made a super heavy, super tiny black substance, a ball of pure negation. This super heavy, super dense ball couldn't be explained, but it could be named. And thereafter, we would associate the name of the Father, in psychoanalytical terms, with weight. Weight had pulled down the Father of the heavens into earth, buried it, and made a tombstone reading, "Here lies Jove." Milton was the first to realize the significance of the fallen god Lucifer and give him his due in the poem Paradise Lost. Note that Milton also gets the projective geometry of the situation right. Jove, also known as Lucifer, lands upside down. Or is it us? Milton refuses to say. It's time to return to Vico's original image of the clearing in the forest. We can see now that this circular space was really created out of the thunder's literal condensation. How its simple circularity was really a composite of antithetical forces coming together in a compressed supersphere of meaningfulness without meanings. The result only could have been what actually turned out to be in history, a production space, a factory for latency. Just as Vico showed with his experimental lipogram, the Dipintura frontispiece for the new science of 1744, the circle is crammed full of things that serve as high-functioning enigmas, able to face any and all geographical and historical contexts, to make a multiplicity of cultural forms using a common mental language that would forever be unstable but not untheorizable. Vico's argument is that we can theorize without knowing everything. This makes all thinking a kind of ersatz enterprise, an invention, a play. We are playing with fire, with the negatives. So anything we say literally is going to burn up in its own self-contradiction. All we can do is mark out the spaces where latency itself has given over to forms, meaning formations, as in the case of the courthouse facade or the countless stories, artworks, music, etc. that deal with this emptiness. In architecture, this means that the idea of the void and the structuring of the void are primary. Without a doubt, architecture is synonymous with the void. It's what makes it the greatest among the arts. It's too bad that architecture theory since the 1980s turned away from understanding projective geometry, which was actually discovered largely by an architect, Girard Desargues, working with the boy genius Pascal in the 1600s. The real projective plane is something we can barely understand. Like Vico says of the imaginative universal, the first metaphor that initiates human thinking proper, it is the continuing foundation we use on a daily basis, our root program, so to speak. The fact that projective geometry and metaphor share an equal ground in the function of negation, in the forms of self-intersection and non-orientation, is an exciting conjecture that has much to offer architecture theory in the future.